As I shared with you, I am joined this morning by a Nobel Prize winning economist, Michael Spence. Michael Spence for a very exciting fireside chat about the many dynamics and forces that could shape the direction for our industry, if not the world. Throughout his tenure as a professor at Harvard, Stanford, and New York universities, Dr. Spence has done extensive research and work on market with asymmetrical information and developed a theory of signaling to show how better informed individuals in the market communicate their information to the less well-informed to avoid the problems with adverse selection. He has written and published several works, including The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World, and A Plan to Fix a Fractured World. In 2001, Michael received the Nobel Prize in Economic Science, honoring his work on the informational structure of markets. He currently focuses his renowned research on economic policies in emerging markets, the economics of information, and the impact of leadership on economic growth. Together this morning, we'll explore a variety of topics, but the most important goal of the discussion is a simple one: to help us open our minds, understand issues, and challenge which may impact us in energy sector, the companies we work for, or the energy industry as a whole, and maybe most and importantly, about how our industry and we must evolve to overcome these challenges and succeed. So let's get started and welcome Michael to the stage. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Shay. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, it's a little intimidating. I don't normally in a classroom see this many people. But I want to just say one other thing, if I could.
Of course. Just
listening to the four of you speak this morning, I'm much more optimistic than I was when I arrived this morning. I think that it's just really encouraging to see people committed to this and notwithstanding the magnitude of the challenges. Over to you.
Thank you for joining us. And before I start, you are an economist, but I want to ask if you have ever crossed paths with IEEE in your career?
Yes, I did. Actually, this is a long time ago. I mean, there are not many people in the room my age. But approximately 50 years ago, after I wrote my PhD thesis on this informational structure, I was invited to the part of IEEE that deals with signal processing and whatnot, so they thought there might be some connection, between the informational structure of markets and the kinds of technical issues they dealt with. So I had a very interesting interaction, and then I dropped out for 50 years, and now I'm thankful to be back.
We are very happy to have you here. I want to start our conversation by hearing your thoughts on some big picture issues. Overall, what do you see as the big economic issues and challenges facing the U.S. and world economy as a whole?
Well, that's a simple question. So there's lots of ways to see what's going on in the world, but the way I think of it is that there's three powerful sets of forces operating. One, you've already talked about. This is, high frequency, high severity shocks being delivered at an increasing pace, from climate, from wars, from pandemics, from financial crises, and so on. And it's global. I mean, it's happening everywhere in the world. I mean, you all know Pakistan was 1/3 underwater a couple of years ago, et cetera. Southern California was flooded, as you just heard. So that's one set. And that's producing major change. The second is a set of things that people don't think about as much, though they get mentioned, and these are long-term secular trends. So we are, and I don't want this to sound too pessimistic, but we've had a downward trend in productivity growth pretty much globally. That's in part the reason that global growth is slowing. The IMF says we're now down to 2%. We were at 3.8% globally before the pandemic. There's aging in the part of the economy that produces about 80% of total output, all the developed world and China, et cetera. I mean, this is a fairly long list, but these are powerful forces that we have to deal with and counteract. And then the third, on a kind of more upbeat side, is we're in the midst of three incredibly big scientific and technological transformations. One is and they're connected. The multi-decade digital one with this, super powerful Gen AI contribution, but there's a 15-year sequence, image recognition, language recognition, all kinds of things that preceded it. The second one is a slightly less talked about, but really important revolution in biomedical and life sciences. And the third one is the energy transition that you all are going to engineer. And so all of these things are colliding in the global economy. And what you see is stuff that we haven't dealt with before. Very rapid structural change at a pace that we're not used to because of the multiplicity of these driving forces. We are seeing inflation for the first time in, 4 decades, something like that. After the great financial crisis, we had, most of you don't do monetary policy, but we had zero interest rates and negative real interest rates and huge injections of liquidity, and the inflation was below target, 2%, right? That world is over, right? So now we're going to live in a world where inflation's in play, the interest rates are higher, there's an open question about whether the cost of capital is going to be more or less permanently higher, et cetera. The global supply chains are being completely reconfigured in pursuit of resilience. We lived for most of the post-war period in a world in which basically the global economy was put together on the basis of efficiency and comparative advantage considerations. That's just not true anymore. There's a national security overlay, there's geopolitical tensions, there's just flat out diversification to protect yourself from these shocks. And you can, if you go to the architects of these global supply networks, you can see it happening in real time. I live in Europe. We're in the midst of a high-speed diversification away from dependence on Russian fossil fuel because we have to. Because of the war, sanctions, and the reluctance to be dependent. So all of that is going on, and it's confusing, it's challenging, but there are opportunities here, and we'll probably get to those.
Thank you, Michael. It's fascinating to see that from a perspective of economists and coming completely outside of this industry. There are so many synergies and challenges that we live through in energy sector, from inflation to the impact of geopolitical issues on supply chain and so forth.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better time to have cross-functional voices at the table to solve these societal problems that we are dealing with in energy sector. So maybe the next thing that I would like to hear from you is that what impact you would see climate change having on world economy, and is there any historical example of how economies overcame such existential challenges?
It's hard to think of one where we actually faced an existential threat. There have been periods, multiple periods of enormously powerful structural transformation of the type that we are going through now. I mean, if you go back, I don't know how much economic history you know. Basically, growth in the sense that we know it today is a post-industrial revolution phenomenon. There was essentially no growth in the world up until that point. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. So that period where we entered high growth, driven by engineering and technology, the harnessing of energy and so on, was a very turbulent period and not easy. I mean, Charles Dickens wrote books about what it was like in London for people trying to make this transition when we didn't have good public health and all that kind of thing. So but that wasn't an existential threat. So I think that what's unique about this situation is, one, it is an existential threat if left unattended, and two, it's global, right? We just need everybody in the game in order to solve it. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but by far the world's largest emitter of CO2 right now is China. It's double the United States and double Europe. Per capita, it's, doesn't look that bad. Most of the growth in the world is going to come from places like that. India is growing at 7.3%. It's a pretty small economy now. So there's just an enormously powerful energy transition that's required to hold down the emission of greenhouse gases while this growth goes on. Now, some people say, well, it'd be better if we didn't have that growth. That's not an option. You can't go to 1.4 billion Indians and say, well, it's too late, you can't grow. So it's global, and there are enormously difficult issues having to do with the distribution or absorption of the costs that we'll come to in a minute.
I appreciate it. I'm not sure if you heard from, you were here, yes, you heard from Joe that we have 13,000 participants from 77 countries at the show, and from Eric and Jill about the challenges and the threats, and specifically for groups like IEEE Power and Energy Society. What are your 3 recommendations of how to adapt to these challenges and also succeed?
Well, the first one is, human beings tend to like challenges, I discovered. And so if you get yourself into the frame of mind, which I heard this morning, that these are big challenges, but that's what, our most creative efforts and young people are going to get done. That's an important starting point. I would say the second thing is, if we try to do this in an adversarial form, with regulators on the one side and whatnot, as opposed to all pulling in the same direction and collaborating, then I don't think we'll succeed, right? So that would be another. And for reasons that we'll probably come to, having to do with financing and fairness and whatnot, that's just essential. And so I think those 2, I would say, are the most important. The third is just unleashing the power of technology. We probably can solve something like half of this problem with technologies that you already collectively have at your disposal and know about. The rest of it, is going to take real innovation and new technology. And one of the nice things about being in this country is we're pretty good at that. We have really dynamic, entrepreneurial, scientific, engineering ecosystems. One striking thing that you may not know is when I was not that much younger, maybe 25 years ago, you could count in tech sectors, health tech, digital, et cetera, you could count the sort of major centers of entrepreneurial activity on the fingers of, at best, 2 hands. That's just not true anymore. It's a truly global phenomenon. There's unicorns in India and China and Latin America, and even some in Europe where I live. So that's very encouraging. It means this positive energy kind of thing is spreading.
Before I get to some more specific questions, we have a variety of professionals here with us, some in the beginning of their career, and there are also many engineers across all facets of energy sector. How do you see the workplace changing over the coming decade, especially in the world of AI and automation?
To me, it's transformational. So I wrote a paper with James Menique at Google on this subject, and it's a little bit in the book that Gordon Brown and Mohammed and Ilarian and I wrote. So in a world in which the supply side is having trouble catching up with the demand, that's the trigger for inflation, where there's aging, rising dependency ratios, which means how many young people are available to support the old folks like me who are retired, et cetera. what's the one thing you would really like to have? And and the answer, after you think about it for a minute, is a huge sustained surge in productivity. And I think that's what we're going to get. Now, it's not I mean, by saying that, I mean potential, right? But in order to achieve that, we have to overcome some obstacles. One is what they call an automation bias. So Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford describes this as the Turing trap. So I'll take a minute and explain it. Alan Turing is the genius who brought us computers. And the major prize in computer science and AI is the Turing Prize, named after him. And he basically proposed that we assess progress in the area of artificial intelligence by asking, can we produce a machine that when a human being interacts with that machine, the human being thinks they're interacting with another human? Kind of stretch goal. Maybe artificial general intelligence. All AIs are benchmarked against human performance. You can see it. Image recognition, 2015, 16, the AIs went past average human performance. Does it beat the kids in law school aptitude test, et cetera? You see what I'm saying? That's all fine. That's a natural way to benchmark your progress in AI. It's the next step that's dangerous. And the next step is, well, the AI beat the average human, let's get rid of the human. And that's a huge mistake, just a huge mistake. So this is a lot, we don't have time to do this all this morning, but basically the natural use of these things for the foreseeable future is as powerful digital assistants or machine-human collaboration. They're great at writing first drafts. It was already mentioned this morning, they write code, but you don't just use the code, you go check it. They write doctor's reports, but the doctor's not going to hand it in. A lawyer used ChatGPT to create a brief for the court and handed it in without checking. ChatGPT made up all the legal precedents, literally. They were all hallucinations. So if we get ourselves in that mindset, then I think we've got the chance to do this. And I can't find a place in the economy, in the science and engineering world in which there isn't a pretty powerful application of this. So it's not a done deal. We're in a period of intense exploration and experimentation. Nobody has a crystal ball that tells them what the world's going to look like in 5 years, but I think the potential's enormous. There's one other thing that's important. The policy agenda is very heavily focused now on preventing or mitigating risk and preventing misuse of these technologies. All powerful technologies have upside potential and downside risk. It's not just ChatGPT. Take gene editing. Gene editing is, transformational technology, but misused, it's truly dangerous. And AI has got the same kind of characteristics. But what we need is a positive agenda, because what's going to happen now is the big players in the game are going to start using AI and finding ways to advance there. But there's a whole range of sectors and small and medium-sized businesses that need to be part of this transformation. And that accessibility and diffusion process is something where you need public policy support. So I'm kind of optimistic, but it's not a done deal. Yeah.
I cannot agree more with you. There is a lot to figure out even in our industry and generally as a society, in both industry and academia, to answer questions how to deal with AI. We are having dialogue at IEEE, PES, the papers that they utilize AI, how they need to get treated. And I have my sister somewhere in the audience. She was debating with me that, so you don't run PowerFlow with algorithms anymore. You run an automated software. So does that mean that that's called cheating and it's not?
Right.
So there is a lot to figure out, and now it's at the experimental stage of all of it. So let me shift a little bit toward...
I'll tell you a story.
Yes.
So I gave a talk to the Rotary Club in Milan, where I live, in northern Italy, and I got an email this morning. from them saying, oh, I was interesting, could we have the slides, because I couldn't show them. And then at the end of the email, after they signed off to these two people, Alberto and Carla, it said this was not written by ChatGPT. So I mean, and in academia, we have this problem. We don't really know what to do with it, you know, whether the student, et cetera. There's a lot of learning to go on.
Yes, it is. That's cross industries, definitely. So I'm going to shift a little bit towards the energy sector and utilities. There's an interesting analogy I've been discussing with colleagues lately in parallel between investor-owned utilities and railroad, and perhaps it's not a very popular analogy, I would say. In the 50s, railroad lost its most of passengers' business to air and auto, and they were under a lot of public scrutiny, and they were on the media, and many of us coming from utilities can feel, what they went through. And what remains are regional commuter blinds. And federal policies leading up to that was hostile towards railroad. At one point after the First World War, the government even dictated engine designs and what railroad could buy and operate. Utilities face similar issues, like public reactions over rates, affordability, threats to their business models from solar, and a need for a massive investment to build the infrastructure to address climate change and the data centers and the load growth and everything else that you heard from a number of speakers prior to us. So, do you think investor-owned utilities today, like the railroad of 50s, or how do you see the role of such energy companies in the future economy?
It's a wonderful question. I'm quite sure that the railway situation was mishandled at the time. All of us wish we had better rail services as we enter a period where we have to, achieve energy efficiency and so on. And I think that's a good example of not thinking through in an adversarial kind of thing. But it's not really quite the same. And the reason is that there were alternatives to railroads, right? Airplanes, et cetera, cars, we probably have too many of them. There's no alternative to electricity. I mean, if we screw this up, you'll all suffer, but so will the rest of the economy instantaneously, right? I mean, collectively, there's a light switch for the economy, and you have your fingers on it, and if we flick that switch, it's over, right? So in a sense, in that sense, I think it's really different. So, we can mess this up by putting obstacles in your way or failing to solve difficult challenges having to do with financing and other things. But it will directly impact not just a specific industry, but the entire economy. And maybe that's a good thing, because it'll act as a brake, on moving off in unproductive directions, failing to collaborate and think carefully with you. The reason I feel so strongly about this is my background in informational economics. If you have a decision-making process that doesn't leverage the expertise that exists, usually in a decentralized fashion, you generally underperform. And the government certainly doesn't have the kind of expertise that you have in the industry in order to solve these problems. So it pushes you just completely naturally in the direction of trying to construct the appropriate collaborative mechanisms, not by pretending there aren't, difficult, and issues and potential conflict, but trying to move in that direction. So, I mean, that's a kind of short answer to your question. I think the railway analogy is a cautionary tale, but it's not quite the same as this one.
So what I take away from Michael, is that let's make sure we are not going to mess this up. But
And the
that was
government,
it.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Yes, of course. But the humor of it, that was the humor of it. But what makes me optimistic is that in energy sector, there are platforms like gatherings like this that
Right.
there's a lot of transparent conversations about challenges and things that they didn't work, so we don't go through the process in a hard way. And cross-functional collaborations between the grid operators and the researchers and technologists. So that leaves me hopeful that we are going to manage that transition a lot better than railroad industry. Yeah. And hoping that the policymakers, we do have a lot of interactions with policymakers to ensure that gets communicated as well. And so,
I mean, the part of the analogy that's right is that there's sectors and groups of people who are going to get hurt, in this transition. And it's more difficult the faster it occurs, right? So, people if you give people more time to adjust, it's easier for them. But, there's a coal industry, not just in the United States, but, there's a big coal industry in Poland, for example. Mm-hmm. We can't just obliviously say we're moving on. That's the sense in which I think the rail industry is a cautionary tale. We have to think carefully about who's getting sideswiped on the way through.
Yeah. Now you just reminded me, I'm going off track here, that at PES we've been working quite a lot on workforce development. That's a combination of how to get the young generation into this industry, but how to re-educate and bring the ones that they are in the areas like coal back into the industry. We have a lot in solar and wind and other renewable generation. So for those of you attending PES general meeting in Seattle, you're going to hear quite a lot about that part.
Good.
There is an enormous cost associated with moving towards clean energy economy and electrification. Furthermore, in the US, we are seeing some states move aggressively and some others like slower. How do you think, I'm just now focusing in the US, can achieve national energy goals when the policies are not unified?
Well, another wonderful question. I'm not an expert on sort of federalism. So, I don't think I could give a learned talk on, the division of responsibilities between the states and the federal government. But in this case, it seems to me pretty clear that if you try to do it in a decentralized fashion, meaning only at the state level, it's not the right answer. I mean, we need, for a number of reasons, I think you all know this, but states have fairly severe limits. They vary a little bit from state to state on running deficits and issuing debt, right? Federal government doesn't have those limits, so we need the federal government's financing capabilities as part of the underpinnings of this. At least that's my view. And so I understand why there's some differential in the speed of movement. Part of this has been politicized, for example, in the United States and elsewhere. But we got to push against that and try to, unify. It's not just policies; it's the financing side that I think is so important. We need, it would have been nice if we got started on this a little earlier. I mean, if I'm right that we're entering a higher interest rate environment, we lived for a long time in which you could issue long-term bonds at very low, interest rates, and we should have done it before, because we're talking. I don't know what you're talking about in California or in the United States, but globally, the numbers I hear are between $4 and $6 trillion of incremental investment per year. That's doable, given the size of the global economy, which is about $100 trillion, but it's still a significant increment over, investment levels now. And then there are just huge issues about how we're going to get that done. We live in a world in which sovereign debt has risen once again, as a result of the pandemic. Fiscal space is declining because of that and the rising interest rates. So, it just makes the challenge bigger, Shay.
So going back to Michael, to the point that Jill made in her speech about affordability as one of the challenges of what we are facing as an industry, how do you balance the need for that investment of billions of dollars to address and address the need and the impact to customer bill and rate?
Right. So I want to be careful not to be impractical here, but I'm going to do what an economist frequently does, which is tell you what a kind of first best solution would be, and then admit that we maybe not be able to achieve it. So a reasonably bad idea is to finance this with rates, right? These are long-term investments, so there's two problems with that. One is it distorts the current level of consumption, and the second one is, we should be financing it in such a way as to spread the costs underneath, the benefits that come out in the future. That's one of the reasons we finance big infrastructure things with debt and not try to pay for them, or the interest costs of them by just raising rates. And raising rates for a subset of the population may be necessary because we're stuck in that position, but it's not the right way to redistribute income and wealth, right? I think we all would admit that we have well, maybe not all, but most of us think we have a kind of adverse trend in income and wealth distribution in the United States that we haven't successfully addressed. I mean, there are studies that indicate that the upper end of the income and wealth distribution pay lower taxes than the average American now. That's just unacceptable. It's the opposite of a progressive tax system, but the right way to deal with the distributional issues, is to deal with it through, those instruments, the tax system and so on. If we can't do that at the state level, you may be forced to do other things, consider other options, but they have distortive effects that are not ideal.
So with the economic tension threaten the actions that we have to take to address all of these issues that we talked about, there is a worry that the benefit of the clean energy transition are being relegated to the wealthier few, be that those who can afford solar and EV. How do you make sure that all share the benefits, or is that simply unrealistic?
The you is me? Right. So I think the only answer to this is, apart from distributional things that we just talked about,
yes,
is you got to count on driving the costs down. And there's lots of examples of why that happens. I mean, you see it in digital, you see it in solar, et cetera. So you may need transition policies to make this thing fair, but the long run goal is to essentially drive the costs of these things down, so a sustainable energy, system is also basically the most cost-effective system. And if you look at solar costs, 10 years ago they were, not even remotely close to competitive with fossil fuels. Now they are, if you have the right smart grid and backup storage or some, all the things you all are going to solve for the rest of us. In those dimensions, but I don't think, how do I say it? I would sort of bypass that problem, and the transition policy, if you want to have one because of the lack of fairness, because EVs are still pretty expensive, is to subsidize them, right? So they're accessible to everybody. And for that, you need the federal government, right? It's the only entity that's big enough financially and has the financing, capability in order to do that. I don't think we can accomplish that at the state level, mostly.
So now let me focus in California. We are in California.
Yep.
There are some discussions to address the issue of costs and investments, to tie it to income. So you pay more for energy if you make a higher income. It's a pretty innovative way of thinking about the cost allocation and rate design. What do you think about that? Do you think it can work?
I'd be kind of a little careful about going down that road, you know, for a couple of reasons. One, you could get unanticipated effects in terms of mobility, you know, carried to an extreme, people will start moving. By the way, you have the same problem with taxation systems,
yes.
Right? You know, people will pick up their marbles and go somewhere else. So I don't think I've completely thought through all the implications of that, but I would say if one goes down that road, one wants to keep it somewhat under control and try to make it transitory, because it's not the right long-run answer.
So I don't want to walk away from this conversation being so negative, and I'm going to shift a bit with a tone of optimism. Mm-hmm. What is the good that could come from all the changes and the future energy investments needed to address the growth, climate, and weather issues?
Well, so quite apart from the fact that, you know, it's an existential threat, sustainable growth is a growth strategy. It's just not for next year, right? You know, but sometime down the road, you know, things will go badly off the rails economically if we don't do this. So that's one benefit. There are other ones. There's lots of parts of the world that are not energy independent, but they will be, or much more energy independent in a green technology world, because you don't have to import wind or sun or things like that. Pick any technology that, you know, is being developed, even fusion, if it ever arrives. You know, this is a kind of is a major change in the sort of economic landscape of the global economy. Let me give a concrete example. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine, especially the war in Ukraine, produced a big increase in energy prices, right? And they're most noticeable in Europe, which is not even remotely close to energy independent. Among other things, that produced an increment in profits in the major oil producers, prominently in the Middle East, of well over $1 trillion. That's a tax, basically, on the rest of the kind of global economy, the people who pay it. We don't feel this as much in the United States, although we react to energy prices because they're set globally, essentially, because we're now relatively energy independent. All of that will go away in a world that has a sort of completely different sustainable energy configuration. So I think there's, and then there's this thing we talked about before, which I think is, it's a big challenge, but I think, people are going to make their careers, and their enjoyment of work and excitement, by solving this problem, and economists don't like to talk about that kind of thing because it's hard to measure, but it's pretty important in terms of human motivation and feeling that you've really done something incredibly important. And I think I would put that on the benefit side.
That's great. So how about innovation? Innovations are always proved vital as our society evolves and transitions from one technological age to the other. Can you talk about the importance of innovation and how you see benefiting the energy sector in particular?
We probably all know more about it than I do, but I think, artificial intelligence is going to be an important part of your life. One of the things that's not talked about very much is that these artificial intelligence technologies that are coming at us, and I don't think they're done, by the way. I mean, I think we're at the start or early stages of this. I think one of the things these things are going to do is dramatically increase the performance characteristics, not just of people, by providing a digital assistant, but systems. So, and you are the master of running complex systems. But it's not just you. I mean, the major players in the global supply chains have figured out that the artificial intelligence tools may actually be a very important tool for increasing the efficiency and resilience of these global supply chains. Because the global supply chains, unlike the things you construct, are constructed in a completely decentralized fashion. And nobody, literally nobody, can see the whole picture, right? It's opaque. And so when something goes wrong in it, as it did in the pandemic, you can't pick it up until it hits you in the face. You know, you order the stuff for Christmas in September and somebody says, oh, I'm sorry, this is an unusual year. It should have been done in May. And then it's too late, right? That happened over and over again in the pandemic because the supply chains were jarred out of, you know, equilibrium so badly, and everybody went into either got shut down or went into survival mode, cut their inventories and all that kind of thing. With the AI tools and sufficient digital data and some cooperation among the players in the game, you can now see into this. And you need these tools because in this respect, they're superhuman. You could hand a human being all the data on the global supply chains that are all interconnected in kind of complicated ways, and we couldn't process it, but the AIs can. And so I think in multiple, you know, there's similar things being written about ambient intelligence in things like the healthcare sector. You know, an AI can keep track of pretty much everything that's going on in a hospital, right, or surgery or whatever. So it's early stages, but I think, you know, this is a subset of the powerful tools that are going to be available to manage energy efficiency, to make smart grids really work, et cetera. Not the whole story, but it's probably an important part of it.
Thank you, Michael. Bernard Pivot, a French journalist, ended every interview with a list of pointed questions to better understand the person they were talking to. So I'm going to take some creative liberty with these ones he asked to get to know Michael way better. So here we go. Who's your favorite economist?
Adam Smith. I'm not going to explain that.
I did not think so.
That's because I'm Scottish and by background. I think the two greatest economists of all time were Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, the one who understood how markets work and whatnot, and why specialization is so important. The other one's John Maynard Keynes. So if I had, I mean, that's a hard choice, but I'll take Smith.
Now I have so many questions about that, maybe after this. So what economic model or theory tells us more about the world we live in today?
So this is a really interesting question, and I'm going to be brief. Economic models tend to be based on what we call equilibria. When you're in we are much less good in economics at building models that help us understand complex transitions where we're, in a sense, out of equilibrium or in transition from one equilibrium to another. So we don't have good models. I think the straight answer to your question is the best help we get in understanding this kind of thing is from economic history. Right? Because there you can, you know, you're not tied down to some model, and the historians can unpack, you know, the dynamics that goes with these big changes. The steam engine comes, electricity comes, and there's 5 decades of reconfiguring everything in manufacturing and so on. And there, you know, a lot of smart people have written about that, and that probably helps more than the models that we have.
What inspires you?
I think the creativity and entrepreneurial activity of the young people across the globe, no question.
Oh, I can relate to that. What depresses you?
So I'll be honest about this. What I find depressing in the world right now is the polarization, both within countries, political and social polarization, and across countries. So it's everything from why we don't like each other, you know, when we're in a bad mood, within our own country to, the geopolitical tensions and the kind of cartoonish picture that we sometimes paint of people who live far away, and it confusing, countries and policies with individuals. We do a whole lot better, I think, as human beings when we're interacting with each other as individuals. So that's worries me a lot.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt? And if you say engineer, you get bonus points.
Yeah, so I will say that. I mean, the way I interpret this question is, not do you wish you were doing something different from what you're doing. I don't regret the choice. Being an economist has been very rewarding. But if I were starting now, I would pick between AI, computer science, and artificial intelligence, something in that area, or that's engineering. So I get the bonus points. Or the other option for me would be biomedical and life sciences, because I think there's a revolution going on there that's really kind of fun and interesting, overlaps with the digital one, and I'd probably be drawn into neuroscience. I mean, I think the chance of advancing in neuroscience because of whatever analogies there are with artificial intelligence is really striking.
Promise, a few more. If you could change one thing about economy, what would that be?
About the economy?
Yes.
I would change the distributional trajectory. I mean, I think if we keep going in this direction, with people struggling day to day on the one hand and, some significant fraction of the wealth, being parked in balance sheets of, relatively small collection of people. I mean, there's 100 different ways to measure this, but they all point the same conclusion. If I could wave a magic wand and reverse those trends, I would. I don't think they're the whole story of what divides us, but they certainly contribute to it. I mean, when if our fellow citizens think the system's rigged, they're not wrong, in a sense. That, it is working for everybody. That's the thing I would change.
Here's the last one. How would you like to be remembered, Michael?
I'd like to be remembered as a nice guy, pretty good teacher. I was a terrible teacher. Can I tell a story? I'll finish with this. So when I was, I almost quit, and when I was doing my PhD, because I'd been talking to myself for so long, I got tired of it, and I thought, maybe I'll do something else, in libraries. And I went to one of my advisors, a brilliant guy named Richard Zeckhauser. He's one of the best bridge players in the United States. I said, I'm going to quit and go work for McKinsey. And he said, well, just hold your horses here for a minute. He said, you need human contact. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, you have to teach, right? So he sent me into a classroom. It was a course an undergraduate course at Harvard on social choice or something like that. So I prepared 50 pages of single-spaced handwritten notes for a 45-minute class at Harvard. And then I got to teach it. So I got through the first 3 pages in the first 40 minutes, and I thought, gee, I got to get to the end. So I speeded up, and that produced the educational equivalent of whiplash. And Richard said afterward, that went okay for a while, and then it all went badly. And I became a good teacher when I learned to listen. And the classes always became more interactive. Now I love teaching because usually I say something either stupid or, whatever, that provokes a response, and we have a conversation. And that's a better way to teach. I think it's a general lesson in that, which is if you're in learning mode and you want really to have a successful interaction, you got to listen. So I'd like to be remembered for that, and having done my best to contribute to the kind of economic advancement of people in lots of places around the world.
Thank you, Michael, for joining us and allowing us to get to know you better. Please join me thanking Michael for making the trip from Europe. Thank you so much.
That's great.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. So the conference is open. The show floor is going to open at 10 o'clock. I wish you a wonderful conference, and I look forward to hearing great stories of partnership and how this platform at IEEE PES is going to help transitioning our industry. Thank you very much.
I would like to